Dawn broke over the rugged hills of Okinawa, April 1945. Mist clung to the jagged ridges where Japanese defensive positions had been dug deep into the coral and earth. Silence hung briefly, tense, brittle, as if the island itself were holding its breath. Then came the first echoes, the thunderous roar of American artillery, each shell tearing through morning haze, shaking trenches and bunkers alike. Dust and smoke rose in swirling clouds, blurring the edges of jagged terrain. Japanese officers crouched behind reinforced positions scanned the horizon. Their maps offered no comfort. The pattern of destruction was beyond expectation. Lines that were meant to hold firm fractured under repeated barrages. Communications faltered. Signals flags waved ineffectively amid smoke and chaos. The infantry advancing behind the artillery surge pressed forward, exploiting every gap in the defensive network. Officers barked orders, but the devastation of the bombardment rendered coordination almost impossible. Every burst of artillery was measured in both distance and fear. In that instant, the tide of battle felt inevitable. The artillery had not only broken ground, it had broken confidence. In the still moments between shelling, the officers understood the unthinkable. Their positions, meticulously prepared for months, were collapsing faster than reinforcements could arrive. The stage was set. What followed would reshape the battle and test the limits of leadership, morale, and survival. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its most brutal phase. The United States, advancing steadily through its island-hopping campaign, had reached the Ryukyu Islands. Okinawa, strategically positioned as a gateway to the Japanese home islands, became the focal point of Allied operations. The campaign was conceived not merely as a territorial gain, but as a staging ground for an eventual invasion of Japan itself. Both sides understood the stakes. American forces were prepared. Extensive reconnaissance had mapped terrain, fortified positions, and potential avenues of advance. Infantry units, supported by armor and artillery, were trained for coordinated assaults. Artillery units, in particular, had been positioned to maximize firepower against entrenched positions, with calculations accounting for elevation, range, and overlapping fields of fire. Shells were delivered with precision, informed by spotters and aerial reconnaissance. The goal was not simply destruction, but controlled disruption, breaking defensive lines methodically before infantry engagements. Japanese defenders, meanwhile, relied on a doctrine of static fortification. Years of preparation had gone into tunnels, bunkers, and interlocking fields of fire. Officers expected attacks to be repelled through terrain advantage, disciplined resistance, and attrition. Coastal hills were fortified with artillery, machine gun nests, and hidden mortars. Communications relied on runners and flags in some sectors, radios in others. But lines were vulnerable under sustained bombardment. Logistics presented another challenge. By this stage, Japanese forces were strained. Supply lines were disrupted by Allied naval and air superiority. Ammunition was carefully rationed and artillery emplacements often lacked redundancy. Troop rotations were minimal, and exhaustion compounded the pressure. Morale, though still bolstered by loyalty and indoctrination, faced the reality of relentless assault and mounting casualties. American artillery doctrine had evolved with experience. Pre-planned barrages, counter-battery fire, and creeping bombardments created synchronized pressure across multiple sectors. Artillery was not only destructive but psychological. Continuous shelling eroded confidence and forced command decisions under stress. Japanese officers, trained for static defense, found their assumptions challenged. Positions designed to withstand infantry assaults were vulnerable to concentrated firepower delivered with speed and accuracy. Environmental factors amplified these dynamics. Okinawa's terrain favored hidden positions but limited mobility. Coral ridges and dense foliage could protect small units, but also concealed artillery observers, who directed fire with lethal efficiency. Weather, tides, and terrain altered the effectiveness of both defense and attack. In this context, every shell that landed carried more than kinetic energy. It carried operational consequences, testing both planning and adaptability. The stage for the breakthrough was thus set, an intersection of tactical preparation, logistical pressure, environmental constraints, and human endurance. What followed would demonstrate the decisive impact of artillery on battlefield psychology and the fragile balance between preparation and collapse. As the battle progressed, Japanese command structures began to show strain under the relentless assault. Field officers attempted to maintain cohesion, issuing orders for counterattacks, positioning artillery, and shoring up weak points. Yet, communication lines were increasingly compromised. Shellfire disrupted runners, cut telephone wires, and rendered visual signals unreliable. In many sectors, officers had to make split-second decisions without confirmation from higher command. The American strategy was methodical. Artillery units, coordinated with infantry and air support, struck with synchronized timing. Pre-assault bombardments targeted command posts, communication hubs, and supply depots. Counter-battery fire neutralized Japanese artillery wherever possible. This combination of firepower and precision ensured that defensive preparations were systematically undermined before ground forces engaged. The cumulative effect of repeated bombardments created gaps in defensive lines, destroyed emplacements, and forced Japanese troops into exposed positions. Japanese officers trained to hold positions at all costs faced a psychological dilemma. Retreat was dishonorable according to doctrine, yet remaining in place under heavy bombardment risked annihilation. Reports from surviving personnel indicate heightened stress levels, confusion, and a sense of disbelief as the scale of destruction unfolded. Even experienced officers recognized that the artillery had achieved what months of fortification had been unable to prevent. Supply shortages compounded the problem. Ammunition and reinforcements could not reach forward positions consistently, and exhausted troops were forced to operate with minimal rest. Trenches and bunkers, while still partially intact, were now vulnerable to direct hits and secondary effects like collapsing earth and shockwaves. Casualty evacuation became nearly impossible under constant bombardment, leaving injured soldiers exposed and further straining morale. From the American perspective, these conditions validated tactical planning. Continuous artillery pressure had not only caused physical damage, but had systematically degraded enemy command and control. The disruption of Japanese communications and the visible impact on officers' ability to coordinate their defenses provided the psychological leverage needed for infantry to exploit breaches with minimal risk. The convergence of these factors, persistent bombardment, logistical strain, disrupted communications, and deteriorating morale, set the conditions for a decisive moment. When American artillery struck with coordinated precision, it did more than destroy fortifications. It shattered the expectation that Japanese lines could hold. Officers who had relied on static defense now confronted the realization that their positions were vulnerable beyond anticipation. This fragile balance between preparation and collapse, strategy and reality, led directly to the breakthrough that would define the battle. The moment of rupture was approaching, where artillery would transform from a tool of attrition to a decisive instrument of battlefield dominance. Inside the defensive positions, the human toll was immediate and visceral. Japanese officers observed their troops reacting to artillery with a mix of trained discipline and growing panic. Soldiers flinched at each concussive blast, covering ears, ducking into trenches, and huddling behind coral walls that offered limited protection. Communications broke down as messengers were struck or turned back by falling debris. Officers, aware of the expectations of honor and steadfastness, faced immense psychological pressure. They had been trained to maintain composure and inspire confidence, yet each shell landing closer to command posts tested resolve. Decisions had to be made swiftly: reposition troops, adjust fire, or prepare for inevitable breaches. Fatigue and fear intermingled, creating a tense atmosphere where human endurance was pushed to the limit. American soldiers, in contrast, operated under a calculated rhythm. Artillery crews worked with precise timing, observing results through binoculars, adjusting fire in real time, and coordinating with advancing infantry. Human resilience was tested differently, by endurance, coordination, and focus under relentless repetition. The emotional impact of witnessing the destruction was not limited to officers or enlisted men. Civilians on the periphery, often forced to take cover in hastily constructed shelters, absorbed the psychological effects of the bombardment. For all involved, the human dimension of artillery was as much about fear, exhaustion, and adaptation as it was about injury or death. Angle 2. Tactical precision. The breakthrough relied on meticulous tactical planning. American artillery units deployed in overlapping fields of fire, ensuring continuous pressure across multiple sectors. Forward observers and aerial reconnaissance coordinated with ground units to refine targeting, striking bunkers, trench lines, and communication nodes. The systematic nature of this approach left Japanese officers with little room to maneuver. Defensive positions that appeared secure on maps became untenable under sustained bombardment. Counter-battery fire, designed to neutralize Japanese guns, further reduced their ability to respond effectively. Every shell was calculated to exploit weaknesses in terrain, fortification, or enemy coordination. Tactical precision extended beyond destruction. It shaped the battlefield psychologically. Officers witnessing gaps forming in their lines recognized that infantry would soon exploit these breaches. Artillery, in this sense, functioned as both weapon and signal, an instrument announcing the inevitability of forward movement. Angle 3. Leadership under stress. Japanese officers faced leadership tests that combined tactical, moral, and personal challenges. Orders to hold positions collided with evidence of crumbling defenses. The chain of command became unreliable as radio lines failed and messengers were lost. Officers had to improvise under pressure, making decisions with incomplete information and facing the immediate consequences of failure. American command emphasized synchronized coordination, but allowed subordinate units flexibility to adjust fire and advance where openings appeared. The contrast highlighted differing doctrines. Japanese leadership prioritized rigid adherence to orders and honor, while American officers leveraged adaptability, discipline, and real-time situational awareness. This leadership tension became a defining feature of the breakthrough. Japanese officers' disbelief at the effectiveness of artillery was not merely technical. It revealed the limits of doctrine when confronted with overwhelming firepower, continuous pressure, and rapidly changing battlefield conditions. From the Japanese vantage point, the American artillery was overwhelming not only in volume, but in unpredictability. Forward positions, once secure, were pocked with craters. Trenches collapsed, and observation posts destroyed. Officers who had relied on terrain and prepared defenses suddenly faced a dynamic battlefield in which artillery dictated every movement. Reports from surviving Japanese personnel describe shock and disorientation. They were trained to anticipate infantry assaults, often with limited artillery support, not to endure continuous, coordinated bombardments designed to methodically unravel their defenses. This dissonance between expectation and reality heightened confusion and eroded morale. Even the most experienced officers struggled to process the tactical situation under the duress of relentless shelling. Angle 5. Technological superiority. Artillery effectiveness in the Pacific campaigns was a product of both quantity and technological refinement. The U.S. Army employed a combination of 105mm and 150mm howitzers, often in concentrated barrages supported by fire direction centers. Forward observers relayed precise coordinates, and aerial reconnaissance allowed real-time corrections to improve accuracy. Shell design, timing, and explosive yield were optimized to neutralize bunkers, destroy fortifications, and create shock among defending troops. This integration of technology and technique magnified the impact of every round, turning terrain advantages into liabilities for Japanese forces. The combination of range, precision, and coordination created an operational environment that Japanese officers had not fully anticipated and were unprepared to counter effectively. Angle 6. Psychological and moral impact. The constant shelling inflicted profound psychological strain on Japanese officers and soldiers alike. Shockwaves, deafening noise, and the sight of collapsed positions undercut confidence. Morale eroded as the perception of invulnerability disappeared. Officers faced the dual burden of personal fear and the responsibility to maintain cohesion among their troops. American documentation later emphasized that the psychological effect of sustained artillery fire often exceeded physical destruction in terms of battlefield outcomes. Troops hesitated to advance, defensive lines faltered, and command decisions slowed. For Japanese officers, witnessing their carefully prepared positions fail under artillery bombardment was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a moral shock, one that presaged the inevitable collapse of defensive cohesion. The combination of human strain, tactical disruption, technological superiority, and moral shock converged to create the conditions for a decisive breakthrough. The moment when the first coordinated artillery strike broke the line would become the turning point of the battle. On the morning of April 1, 1945, the American artillery unleashed its pre-planned barrage across the northern ridges of Okinawa. Sunrise barely penetrated the lingering haze when the first shells struck. The earth shuddered beneath the impact, sending plumes of smoke and dust into the air. Trenches collapsed. Bunkers shattered. Communication lines snapped, leaving Japanese officers scrambling to issue orders in vain. The attack had been meticulously coordinated. Forward observers, perched on exposed ridges and aboard reconnaissance planes, relayed real-time adjustments to batteries positioned miles away. The precision of fire was devastating. Ammunition was concentrated on command posts, artillery positions, and interlocking defensive nodes. Japanese units found themselves isolated, as overlapping arcs of fire rendered movement lethal. Officers watched from slit trenches as gaps formed in their carefully prepared lines. Panic rippled among troops, though discipline held where possible. Yet the shock was undeniable. Months of fortification, careful placement of weapons, and calculated fallback positions were failing under concentrated bombardment. Reports from American after-action logs highlight that the first 2 hours of the barrage created openings that would allow infantry units to advance with minimal resistance. The psychological effect on Japanese leadership was immediate. Officers had trained for attrition, for infantry assaults, But this overwhelming, coordinated artillery was beyond expectation. Written testimonies note expressions of disbelief, rapid reassessment of defensive strategy, and an urgent scramble to reinforce weakened sectors. Meanwhile, American infantry advanced in sync with the artillery's creeping barrage, using the openings created to seize high ground and neutralize remaining positions. The battlefield was transformed from a static defense into a dynamic, collapsing front. Artillery had not only inflicted casualties but had dictated the pace, location, and outcome of engagement. The stage was set for the breakthrough. The Japanese defensive line, meticulously prepared for months, was failing under a combination of firepower, precision, and tactical timing. What followed would define the battle and mark a decisive turning point in the Pacific campaign. By late morning, the American artillery's systematic pressure had fully exploited weaknesses in the Japanese lines. Craters and shattered bunkers created corridors through which infantry surged. Units that had seemed impregnable fell under the combined weight of fire and maneuver. Reports from U.S. Army observers noted that some Japanese positions were neutralized within minutes of the barrage, leaving officers scrambling to coordinate fragmented responses. Japanese command posts, once hubs of coordination, were now surrounded by destruction. Officers attempted to rally troops, reposition artillery, and close gaps. But continuous shelling severed communication with subordinate units. The psychological strain intensified. Even seasoned commanders appeared stunned, observing as carefully rehearsed plans unraveled in real time. American artillery continued to adjust, targeting any emerging defensive concentration. Forward observers relayed corrections with precision. Every round compounded confusion, disoriented the defenders, and ensured that infantry could exploit openings before Japanese forces could recover. The result was not only physical devastation, but operational paralysis. Casualty figures mounted rapidly. Reports indicate that forward Japanese units suffered significant losses, while artillery and machine gun crews struggled to maintain effectiveness under sustained bombardment. The cumulative effect of destruction and shock forced some officers to authorize withdrawals, abandoning previously held positions. For others, the only choice was to fight in increasingly isolated pockets. By afternoon, the breakthrough was complete. What had begun as localized disruption became a cascading collapse of the northern defensive sector. American forces controlled key ridges and access routes, turning what was meant to be a protracted stalemate into a decisive maneuver. The effectiveness of artillery had transformed the battlefield, demonstrating the combined impact of technological superiority, tactical planning, and psychological pressure. This moment sealed the fate of the positions under assault. Japanese officers, though still commanding in isolated sectors, had lost the cohesion necessary to repel the advancing forces. The artillery that had begun as a preparatory measure now defined the pace, direction, and ultimate outcome of the engagement. The breakthrough marked the beginning of the end for this sector of the battle. As the dust settled, both physical and psychological, the consequences of the artillery's power would ripple through subsequent operations. In the days following the artillery breakthrough, the northern sector of Okinawa was decisively under American control. Japanese defensive lines, meticulously constructed over months, had been shattered both physically and psychologically. Casualty reports indicate that thousands of Japanese troops were killed, wounded, or forced into disorganized retreat. American forces suffered losses as well, but the efficiency of pre-planned artillery had reduced the intensity of infantry engagements in many sectors. Field hospitals, overwhelmed during the initial assault, now began triaging and treating the wounded more systematically. The The American command conducted detailed assessments of artillery effectiveness, noting that precision fire and synchronized barrages had minimized unnecessary exposure of infantry. Forward observers, artillery units, and infantry officers all contributed to after-action reports that emphasized coordination as the decisive factor. For Japanese officers, the aftermath was grim. Survivors described the collapse of morale, the difficulty of regrouping fragmented units, and the challenge of restoring communication under constant threat. Those able to organize retreats faced the reality of reduced manpower, limited ammunition, and compromised terrain advantages. Leadership that had once relied on strict discipline was now hampered by chaos. Strategically, the breakthrough accelerated the Allied advance. Positions that were intended to delay U.S. forces for weeks fell in a matter of days. The ability of American artillery to create operational shock demonstrated a tactical principle that would influence subsequent island campaigns. Overwhelming firepower, properly coordinated, could achieve objectives faster and with fewer direct infantry casualties. Simultaneously, Japanese troops outside the immediate breach observed the collapse. The psychological ripple effect was profound. Officers and soldiers recognized that the once formidable positions could not hold indefinitely against coordinated bombardments. Fear, uncertainty, and hesitation spread, further undermining the defensive posture. The stage was set for broader consequences, both operational and moral. The use of artillery had achieved its tactical goal, but it also revealed enduring lessons about the integration of technology, human endurance, and command in modern warfare. As the battle progressed through April, the full implications of the artillery breakthrough became evident. American forces exploited the gaps created by sustained bombardment, systematically securing key terrain features and neutralizing Japanese strong points. Casualty figures compiled by the U.S. Army indicate that Japanese losses in the northern sector exceeded 5,000 killed and wounded within the first week of the breakthrough, while American forces, though heavily engaged, sustained fewer casualties than expected due to the suppression of enemy positions before infantry assaults. Japanese defensive doctrine, once considered formidable, was reassessed in post-war analyses. Officers had relied heavily on entrenched positions, interlocking fields of fire, and the psychological assumption that fortifications would delay or deter attacks. The American artillery, coordinated with infantry and aerial reconnaissance, demonstrated that such static strategies were highly vulnerable when precision fire and operational flexibility were applied effectively. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the psychological consequences were profound. Surviving Japanese officers reported a sense of shock and disbelief at the effectiveness of artillery, which exceeded prior expectations. Morale eroded rapidly in secondary positions as news of the northern sector's collapse spread. Soldiers hesitated to man exposed positions, and command cohesion weakened under pressure. The broader strategic consequence was clear. The breakdown of Okinawa's northern defenses accelerated the overall campaign. Positions that might have delayed the U.S. advance for weeks fell within days, allowing forces to press toward central and southern sectors more efficiently. Lessons from this engagement informed both Allied tactics and post-war evaluations of Japanese defensive strategy, emphasizing the role of concentrated, precise artillery in achieving decisive outcomes. At the human level, the aftermath left scars visible in both survivors and the landscape. Trenches and bunkers were demolished. Forests and ridges bore shell craters, and bodies, soldiers and civilians alike, were a stark reminder of war's human cost. Yet amid devastation, the operational success of coordinated artillery reinforced principles that would define modern warfare: the integration of firepower, intelligence, and mobility to achieve rapid, decisive results. The collapse of these defenses was not merely a tactical event. It became a study in the interplay of technology, human resilience, and the psychology of command. From these lessons, the final reflection emerges, offering perspective on the significance of artillery in shaping not only battles, but the course of the war itself. The artillery breakthrough on Okinawa stands as a stark example of how technology, coordination, and human endurance converge to shape the outcome of modern warfare. In the northern sector, Japanese officers witnessed the disintegration of months of meticulous preparation, not through overwhelming infantry assault alone, but through the calculated precision of American firepower. The battle demonstrated that even the most disciplined and determined defenders are vulnerable when strategy, timing, and technology intersect. Yet the significance of this event extends beyond maps and casualty reports. It illustrates the psychological dimension of combat, how fear, stress, and the sudden collapse of expectations can influence decisions, morale, and cohesion. Officers trained to anticipate static assaults were forced into reactive, improvisational leadership under extreme duress. Soldiers confronted the relentless reality of destruction that reshaped their understanding of the battlefield in real time. The lessons of Okinawa also resonate in the broader evolution of warfare. Artillery had long been a tool of attrition, but here it became decisive, an instrument of operational control and tactical foresight. The integration of observation, coordination, and precision set a precedent for future campaigns, underscoring the importance of technological advantage and strategic planning. Ultimately, the breakthrough reflects a fundamental truth of human conflict. Preparation and courage can be overwhelmed by innovation, adaptability, and calculated force.